Good evening. Welcome to the Hingham Board of Selectmen meeting for Tuesday evening, February 13th, 2018. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the board's February 6th session.
Move to approve the minutes of February 6, 2018.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Public comment on items not on the agenda? Okay. Next up is the Audit Committee recommendation. Hi, Mike. Want to come up to the table, please?
Mike Dwyer, Chair Audit Committee.
Hi, Mike.
Evening.
So, Mike, you've actually sent the board a request, so perhaps you could just kind of brief the audience on the nature of the request and what the Audit Committee is proposing.
Sure, thank you. The town's procures audit services in 3-year increments with the potential to extend for 2 3-year periods. So we're at the end of a 9-year period and just ran a request for proposal, published it, had some responses, and in the end found 2 firms that were noteworthy, that were competitive, and we ran some interviews and reference checks, and the report in front of you is a summary of that process, and we're recommending Clifton Larson Allen instead of the incumbent. And please, you can just run your eye over the top, but what I think we'd say at a 10,000-foot report level is that you are not badly served by Powers and Sullivan whatsoever. The incumbent is tried and true, but we are concerned about a renewal becoming tantamount to an 18-year tenure. The second thing is that CLA did exceptionally well and made and positioned extremely well how they blend their national strength with local presence. One of the things that I know in my own work, some of the other financial things, these GASB promulgations, just wave after wave, pension, OPEB, they're thorny. And Powers and Sullivan is keeping up perfectly adequately, but our sense was that a national firm with an equal and strong local presence is a compelling story. Mm-hmm. One small detail, if I may, is that enough
Please.
Summary? Is that broadly paint the picture?
Sure.
One small detail to bear in mind is the back page. Overall pricing is almost identical. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think these folks get the hang of how to do this work. We can answer any questions about detail scoring if you like, but one thing that is worth bringing to everyone's attention, I think, is that there is a slight variance in the columns.
Notice that.
And that may be worth a little negotiation and tune-up, because as I understand it, some of these entities will be paying this from their own funds.
Correct.
So what might look like a minor variation in columnar values to us could be pretty serious material to them. So this would seem to us as the next couple of steps happen, it's not a big tune-up because the overall price is so close. Anything else I can lead you through on scoring? Or, they're all, there was only one area where CLA was advantageous as opposed to highly advantageous. Mm-hmm. And the fragments and snippets of Chapter 30B we get, which is the procurement statute, looked like, where there was they called it marginal difference or qualitative difference that we were free to recommend, despite the rating being in one area, mm-hmm. one notch less.
Yep. I actually had a question. One of the things you mentioned in the executive summary is that CLA does some sort of an information technology review.
Yes.
Just knowing how much that's part of our world, what do they do?
I don't want to overstate our knowledge, because this was just brief from an interview
Sure.
and a recommendation. But they do consider it a core element of the audit. They do budget some hours for it. And the thing that we thought, the committee, all five of us felt that when they were asked a broad question about risk, their response was cybersecurity and breaches. And we thought that's a very timely. Now, Powers and Sullivan made a good point about, key personnel. That's always a valid business point. But the fact that in their proposal, in their references, and in their assessment of risk, they position technology and cybersecurity struck us as an important advantage
Yep.
for us.
It caught my attention because the town is now have the option where people can pay things online. So you think of citizens entering credit card numbers and other sort of personal information, and it just, it feels like an obligation that we have to try to make sure that their data is well protected.
Thank you for bringing up one of the key points I was supposed to mention. That is, in the executive summary for just that reason, that we were all struck that, building it into the audit and offering it as the top area of risk shows, good positioning on the part of the firm.
Paul or Karen, did you have any other questions? It was a very detailed, it was really helpful, Mike, to read through all the information, and it's clear you went through a rigorous process.
Yeah, I just had one question in terms of consistency of staff at the local level. I feel like that, if you have some confidence in the team that you have in place locally, and I know you never know how and when personnel changes may occur, but I'm just curious as to sort of what your perception was. Would they provide a dedicated team? And
Thanks. Powers and Sullivan at the partner level has been 100% solid, and all the references for CLA made a comparable point. Once you get a partner, you have them for as long as you want. Then what happens is at the manager level, they tend to have reasonable tenures, 2 and 3 years, and at the junior level is where most of them seem to go at least 2 or 3 years, but they don't guarantee it. What I was struck with was I was impressed with the Newton comments, where the respondent is now the mayor, and had really operated at audit committee chair level, city councilor, in other words, report to us with the audit, and her take across the whole thing was that the junior turnover was not troubling, and that overall it was so well managed that there's no hit, if you will.
Yep,
And
yep.
some of the other firms, some of the other references mention those kinds of timeframes, but they all talked about the partner as being literally, we swapped them out when we wanted to have fresh eyes, and the managers being pretty good tenure.
Okay.
Does that address, not
Yeah,
a perfect answer or a guarantee.
No, right.
But it seemed credible, and.
that's what I want to know. Okay. And then lastly, from a process standpoint, I just was wondering about the role that our town accountant, Sue Nickerson, played in this, if at all, and,
She contributes. And our committee work this is rare for us, this RFP. Normally, we're co-editors of the CAFR and associated documents. She's a leading player in that. For this RFP process, we put together the RFP, we come up with the questions and the interviews and did all that. I'll be honest with you, she would prefer to stay with the incumbents. One of our committee members, who's herself a municipal CPA, said to Sue Nickerson, well, how were you when you had the prior accountants? And she said, well, I didn't want to change.
yeah.
And, so we're balancing the potential impact. We were very pleased with, the commitment in the interview. The partner and manager started to rattle off, we figure 10 or 15% extra time from us year one. That's reassuring on a 700-hour endeavor. And the second thing was that a couple of the references, notably Worcester, said, we have a credit union, we have this, we have Worcester Redevelopment Authority, but they're still, what he said was, the CFO said, they go everywhere, but they're out of here in 4 to 6 weeks. That's exactly what we wanted to hear.
Okay.
Some efficiency. So never can wholly guarantee, but some pretty good, again, credible statements to address the issue of turnover.
Okay. And last, Mike, in the columns, and maybe I'm just missing it, is the country club folded into this town side audit, or is the country
I
club?
believe it is, yes. I believe it is, yes.
Paul, anything?
What prompted you to do this?
It's in our charter.
And so Powers and Sullivan has been doing the work for the town for how many years?
9 years.
Have there been any problems reported during that time?
No, although a few of the committee members did focus on this Shrek findings that we put before you earlier. They're not massive, they're not the kind of thing that shake the foundation, but they're a little worrisome. How and whether that should have been detected and when, I'm not sure. But I'd say I would give them at least a B+ and probably an A- overall. Nothing wrong with their work, efficient, town accountant likes them. But we're a little worried about incumbency, and we definitely were impressed with the idea that for a similar quote, we're folding in some information technology that Powers and Sullivan is not really addressing. Does that answer the question, Paul? Can I elaborate in any way?
No.
I remember that when you were here, when we signed off on the financial statements, you mentioned that, per the charter, that you would be initiating a procurement process. And, especially when you think of auditors and external auditors, one of the reasons that we initiated the audit committee and things was to really understand that the size and scope of our town. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that we've had a very, very positive relationship with Powers and Sullivan.
Yes.
And that as part of our due diligence, which I think, it's a good thing for a AAA bond community to rebid many of its professional services contracts, even if you don't have any issues, just to sort of see if there might be some benefit in making the change. I'm impressed with the thoroughness of your process. You laid out the criteria, you evaluated against the criteria, so I would thank you for all the great work and defer to your recommendation on this.
Was it unanimous?
Yes, it was. And what was interesting, if I may say, what gives some credence to the process is we went around the table twice at a big meeting, and the first time it was not unanimous. But as the topics came up and we evaluated and literally traded incumbency against risk management, fresh eyes, technology, an 18-year tenure, we came to the conclusion that, and the other thing I have to say too, is CLA did a better job in the interviews. We didn't document them because unlike the references were notable, I would say, because they provide new information. What I would say happened in the interviews was that pretty comparable responses, but CLA was much more observant of the time, much more focused to the committee's questions, and we have no choice but to consider that as part of the evaluation process. Sure. Because if they can do it, nearly, they were precise within seconds for our 20-minute presentation and 10-minute Q&A. And Powers and Sullivan, you could not go wrong with. But in that setting, for instance, it took 45 minutes. They were not as tight. A couple of us even used the word ramble. So, when you put all the things, it's not, again, you would not be poorly served by the incumbent, I'm sure. But it became unanimous that there's enough value here to warrant a change, and that the CLA firm has put enough assurance to smooth that transition that it doesn't look like it'll be I'd still contract carefully,
Sure.
No.
Okay. Tom, did you have something to add?
Sure. Just to clarify some of what I think Mike is telling us is, and I've had several conversations with Sue over the last couple of weeks during this process. Sue's concerns, as Mike has pointed out, are, she's had some turnover in her office. A couple of positions are down, and she's worried about the ramp-up time for a new audit firm coming in the middle of that, turnover, and what that will mean for her operation. That said, I think what we have to do is weigh that against what we're hearing from our audit committee in terms of the business case for an audit firm. And the reason, and it's a little bit, right, it's a little bit different than the rest of the world. In the auditing world, sometimes incumbency isn't necessarily a benefit, right? So fresh eyes, I think is what Mike is telling us, fresh eyes can provide a strong business benefit for an organization during an audit process. So my initial thought was Powers and Sullivan does a great job, and they know our process, and they know our people, and it works seamlessly. But then I started thinking about it, and they know our process, they know our people, and it works seamlessly. And sometimes in an audit process, it's not really what you're looking for. So I think what Mike is trying graciously to say is that a shakeup isn't a bad thing, and all things being equal, I think the potential disruption in the accountant's office will likely be brief, and we can overcome that. So I would be hard pressed to suggest that you act counter to the audit committee's thorough process.
Thank you.
That was helpful, Tom, thank you.
Anything else? Any questions or comments from the audience?
So the process now, Mary, is if we award this, we'd award it to either one of these vendors, and then they'd come back to us with a contract to sign.
Yeah,
Is that
so
right?
what the vote tonight is whether or not to accept the recommendation of the audit committee, which would then trigger a negotiation.
Great.
To some extent. So just to be clear, because this was an RFP process, we are somewhat limited by 30B in the negotiations. If it was an IFB, an invitation for bid process, you have more leeway for negotiating in the contract stage. Now, that said, I think we can move some of these dollars around, perhaps not necessarily lessening the total value, and I can talk with CLA about that if you were to.
Yeah, that's what I was concerned about, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Would someone like to make a motion?
I move that we accept the recommendation of the audit committee.
I'll second that.
Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
please,
Thanks,
thanks to the rest of the
Yeah,
audit committee.
It's really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next on the agenda is a forecast update, and Tom has, we have copies in our packet, and Tom is also projecting it up on the wall, so those in the audience can see what we've got.
Okay, so we recently did a slight update to what I like to refer to as the revenue forecast. However, there's not a whole lot of revenue update being done at this point, but there were significant updates being done on the expense side of the forecast, so we wanted to try to show everyone the picture as it currently stands. So the main difference, if you'll see in the summary page here, is that our surplus/deficit line moved from 800,000 at the last update to 2.5 million. And there's a number of factors that go into that, which I'll review here. So the only real revenue change in the forecast was we had an increase in the sewer revenue anticipated by $44,000, but that'll simply be offset by the expense increase. I don't say simply, I don't mean that. That'll be offset by the expense side, as it'll be offset by ratepayers.
And I'd just jump in and tell Paul and Karen that the revenue increase was actually triggered, the MWRA, they essentially, you know, we had been given budget parameters, and they essentially said, I think it was what, Tom, a 30% increase?
So it was the Hull,
Or the Hull intermunicipal,
Intermunicipal
pardon me.
agreement, yeah.
Something like 30%, so we had to increase the expense in
Yeah,
the
we
way.
had budgeted 15%, this went up
Right.
to 30, so up an additional 15%.
So the increase in revenue is to cover that cost so that this budget, again, remains neutral to the town.
That's right. Now, we do still have a couple of potential updates to the revenue side of the forecast, as state aid, as the budget moves through the legislature, we may get some updates there, and then local receipts still could clarify as we move forward. Okay, on the expense side, we have Article 4, an additional $50,200 on the expense side for town salaries and wages. We decreased the expenses by $43,000 net. That's an $88,000 reduction, offset by the $44,000 sewer increase we just explained. The Article 4 is going down by a total of $164,000. That's in reaction to moving in some anticipated salary costs for a couple of unions that have settled, and moving them into their budgets and out of Article 4. So, let's see. So we have, I'm sorry, one last item, the inclusion of current administration proposed education budget. This reflects $122,000 in reductions since the initial proposal. We have a couple of potential updates to the FY19. That's the group insurance is still pending, and capital outlay recommendation is also pending. Okay, our next steps, we have a couple of important dates coming up. The 22nd of February is kind of a big day across the state. The GIC will be announcing its group insurance rates. We look forward to getting that information, and as we get it on February 26th, we will be reissuing a new forecast. And hopefully by then, too, we've clarified some of the revenue, some potential final revenue numbers, and some of these final smaller expense side numbers. So also on the 26th, the school committee will be voting their education budget recommendation. On the 27th, here, the Board of Selectmen will be voting all town budgets. The week of March 5th, we're looking at the advisory committee will be voting all their budgets after they've done all their review. And of course, on April 23rd, we have the annual town meeting. Any questions? Okay.
Nope, I had an opportunity to sit with Tom on Monday, so I think I'm good with this.
So.
We had another
Yeah,
presentation.
so, as you know, I'm pretty immersed in this whole forecast budget kind of thing, and in the last week, through a lot of the hearings, I've just been struck by a lot of different things, and obviously a $2.5 million budget deficit at this stage is a little bit higher than we thought. And as I've been listening and you know, thinking about it myself, it struck me that a lot of the people who are involved in those next steps Tom described, whether it's members of the school committee, members of the advisory committee, there are a lot of people who are new into their role, which is terrific. But I know I've said it, and I heard Dr. Gallo say it the other night, that in some ways the budget challenges we have this year are sort of feeling like 2008, 2009. And, you know, Karen, you were on advisory at the time, so you remember it well. And I kind of thought it might be just helpful perspective as we're all thinking about this forecast and in anticipation of some votes to kind of look at that a little bit. So I just start by saying those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I just really think it's worth taking a minute to look back at what happened 10 years ago and some of the lessons that we learned, because I think they might inform decisions that we're making. If you think about 2009, people were feeling personal financial pressure. From a town perspective, our new growth slowed down. Our local receipts were slowing down. State aid was getting cut. And it was at that time that we had a negative credit outlook from the rating agencies. Some of those things are happening right now. You know, the slower than expected growth, we still have residents who are experiencing personal financial pressure. our local receipts, sometimes a little variable. But I wanted to focus a little bit on the credit rating, and the reason for that, as we've been hearing all these budgets, the school committee has stewardship over the school budget. Capital outlay has stewardship over the capital budget. Glenn Olson in the audience has custody of the stewardship of the police budget. I view our board as having stewardship responsibility for not just the entire budget, but also the bond rating. So, Tom, if you could advance it. In 2009, we got a negative outlook. We were a AAA bond rating, and we got a negative outlook. And we were told at the time that we could remove it with a couple of things. We were told that as a town, we were not making sufficient and consistent progress to fund our retiree health care, which we call OPEB. At the time, it was about a $61 million liability, and we had set aside $300,000. And the rating agency essentially said, you're not doing enough. You're not doing enough consistently. We also, at times, we were doing a couple things with capital. In years when the budget was tight, we'd cut capital. We would balance our budget on the backs of capital outlay. The other thing we were doing is we were funding a lot of our capital out of our rainy day fund, our fund balance. In fact, between 2005 and 2009, about 25% of our capital, or about $500,000, was taken out of fund balance. And that leads to the third piece, which was that our rainy day fund was dwindling. And the rating agency essentially said, you've got to stop doing that, and you've got to restore your rainy day fund. They also told us that, they said, well, that's what you need to do to get your rating to go up. What could make it go down? Don't do those things. They also said the adoption of a structurally imbalanced budget. If we adopted less conservative assumptions for revenue and expenditure growth, or if we used a lot of free cash without replenishment. And by the way, I should mention that all these slides, I actually took these from a presentation that was done 10 years ago. Didn't touch them. So what you're seeing is what we literally talked about 10 years ago. And I was really struck as I was looking at these slides that some of these things still hold true today. So what did we do? If we think about our OPEB, we have a 30-year funding schedule. And in fact, we saw that OPEB review last November, and our OPEB trust balance is now $12 million. And that's a combination of both contributions and appreciation. We still have a big liability, and we've learned that our current funding schedule is below where we'd like to be. With capital investments, we did two things. We said we've got a financial policy that says we should invest a certain amount in capital every year, and we've kind of stuck to that. And we've also stopped paying for capital out of fund balance. And what that's allowed us to do is to restore our fund balance. The other thing we talked about 10 years ago was actually budgeting money for fund balance. And I think what we found over the years is that at the end of the year, when departments have budget turnbacks, or there might be a little bit of extra revenue that comes through, that's gone into our fund balance. And so our fund balance is actually very healthy right now, and we haven't had to necessarily put a line item against it. The other thing that we did is, and Karen, you did this on advisory, I did it, I see Craig McKay in the audience, I know the advisory committee is working on it again. We also said, let's adopt a financial policy. Let's put some of this in writing to kind of guide us in terms of where we want to be. And just a couple of highlights that I think we want to think about as we think about the forecast and the budget. The first one says that we should be caught, and these again are snippets from the AdCom financial policy. The town should be cautious in incorporating long-term growth assumptions into the financial forecast. That means we don't want to push the revenue too hard. We got to focus on what we think is going to happen, not what we hope is going to happen. That we should fund our long-term financial obligations and liabilities at a minimum as required by law. And we're doing that with our OPEB. And then the last piece talks about when our unassigned fund balance, or in layman's terms, when we hit our rainy day target, what should we do with that surplus money? And in 2015, the advisory committee said, well, you should think about maybe paying off unfunded liabilities, or maybe capital, or maybe debt. But I put in red something that I think, again, is important as we think about the budget and the magnitude of the deficit that we have. Excess unassigned fund balance should not be used to fund recurring operating budget items. We're going to get ourselves into the trap we were in 10 years ago if we start using our rainy day fund to fund too much of our everyday business. And again, I thought that was instructive. Just for the benefit of people watching, you know, we're talking a lot about our bond rating and what that's worth. And again, 10 years ago, we highlighted that when the town borrowed for some school renovations, our AAA bond rating saved us about $400,000. In 2008, when we were building East School, when all the credit markets were frozen, we were actually able to borrow, and we borrowed at just over a 1% interest rate for a couple of years, which allowed basically, you know, that was less dollars that we had to collect from taxpayers. And in 2009, when we issued $43 million of debt, we saved about $1 million. I talked to Jean Montgomery today, and she mentioned a couple of things that, again, our AAA bond rating have helped us with recently. In 2015, when we financed the middle school and the high school field improvement project, we had an interest rate of 3%. And, you know, how many of our mortgages are at 3%? And then last year, we had a $22 million note. A lot of that was for the outstanding balance on the Lincoln School apartments. We were able to refinance it at 1.39%, which saves us $2 million over the 13 years remaining on that bond. And again, as we think about the Lincoln School apartments, this is less of a debt service payment they have to make, which means more of the money can work within the Lincoln School apartments. So that's a little bit of a benefit. I'll just close. So what were the lessons learned, and what might I ask us to think about in the next couple weeks? Let's be careful we don't push the revenue forecast too far. You know, sometimes you can look at an individual line item and say, well, $100,000 more. We really do kind of have to rely on the data. This next piece I took from a presentation, but it said we need to forecast and budget expenses based on available revenue. And if we think about it, the available revenue is the ceiling. We got to keep funding our long-term liabilities. We can't be short-sighted on capital. Every year, our financial policy says we should spend between, I think it's 2% and 5% of our budget on capital. We've got a placeholder in there of about $2.3 million. We know every year that we have capital needs that are around $2.3 million. So as we're making choices, we should keep that in mind. And then lastly, keeping the rainy day fund really for a rainy day. Not relying too much on fund balance or one-time money to balance the budget, because it may not necessarily be there next year. And I think that's particularly important because many of the budget initiatives that are under consideration right now are personnel related. I think before we hire personnel, we need to have assurance that we will have the ability to pay that salary not just next year, but the year after and the year after. And we also need to be mindful that as we look at costs in our budget, the personnel costs tend to be the fastest growing budget items. And so, again, you know, I think back to 2009, and, you know, Karen, you were on the advisory committee in some tough times. There are aspects of right now that sort of feel a little bit like that, and my hope is that even if we weren't engaged in that process, we can learn some of the lessons from 2009 and, you know, rely on the processes and policies that we have in place to guide us as we close out the budget for this year. Questions, comments?
I wasn't on the advisory committee, but I was working feverishly to maintain the viability of the shipyard during that period. So I can well appreciate the comments that you're making. And you know, I thank you for bringing that to the attention of the public, because we're going to be taking some tough votes shortly. So nobody should really be surprised.
As usual, Mary, really thorough, I think, instructive. I think the thing I would say to sort of follow up on what Paul's sentiments echo is that, over the course of the last 10 years, we've also layered on additional national and state mandates to all departments. As I'm very fond of saying, participated in the Citizens Police Academy last fall and heard a number of additional trainings and priorities that the police department alone has got to find within an existing budget. I think we heard from the schools last week about, again, additional services that are just, asked of you without any dollars coming from, or any meaningful dollars coming from the state or federal government in order to provide those services. So, again, maybe no different than where we were in 2009, but just sort of additional layers of, I think, regulation and mandates. And, you brought up personnel costs. When Dot showed her budget last week and you looked at the pie and you saw that giant piece that was personnel, that's not unlike what we deal with on the town side. That's how we run your local government, is with all of the people that provide services to this town. And those costs have escalated over time, not in an unwarranted fashion or not in an irresponsible fashion, but in a manner that's consistent with the service levels that we expect from our town. So I'd agree with you, Paul. This is not going to be an easy budget process, because I guess what I want to say is, of the budgets we're reviewing, people are asking, I think, for the resources they need to try to do their jobs at the level that they see as required of them. And what we have to say, unfortunately, on our side is, I get that. And if I were sitting in your seat, I would be asking for those very same dollars. But we have to balance all of this, including, as you suggest, the overall financial policy and really ongoing financial health of this town. And, what it meant years ago and what it may mean today is some votes where, people aren't going to get everything they want.
Yeah.
I'm going to be abstaining most of the time.
No way.
We've
All
gone
right.
down that road too many times.
Thank you. That was really well done.
Thank you.
I
Any
agree.
questions or comments from the audience? Okay. Tom, if I may ask, because when we do these forecast updates and things, if we can put it on the website, put both documents as well to forward to our colleagues on the advisory committee and the school committee. They get the very detailed forecast, but let's also make sure that they have everything. Okay, so we have warrant articles now on the agenda. Tom, I see that Article V is listed first, but I don't see Bill in the room. Should we go ahead with, okay. Sure. Why don't we go ahead with Article T, if we could, please, and maybe you could just introduce that.
So last year, or looks like it was back in August of 16, the Board of Selectmen had negotiated with Broadstone Bear Cove, more commonly known as Alliance, who is a 40B developer down at the end of Beal Street. And the Board of Selectmen had negotiated a development agreement that, among other things, culminated in $1 million for the town to purchase windows at the Plymouth River School, the $50,000 for improvements at Bear Cove Park, and among other things, some signboards for the police department, etc. One of the outcroppings from that negotiation included, or was also the deeding over a parcel of land from their ownership to the town. And I think a lot of people in town would probably be shocked to learn that this parcel of land isn't already the town's. What it is, it's the property that at the far end of Bear Cove Park that runs right up into the old the old Hingham Mutual building. And it's the parcel of land actually that has, I believe, the colored trees on it, right? So, anyway, there's a 2.231 acre piece of land that's being deeded to the town as part of the development agreement, and the town meeting has to vote to accept that conveyance.
So this is actually just the implementation of something that was already part of the development agreement and agreed to by all the parties.
That's right.
Okay. Paul or Karen, any questions about this article?
I walked the site, I'm familiar with it.
And Susan signed off completely.
She has, yes.
Susan Murphy.
I remember there were a lot of the negotiation had to do with this particular
Right.
piece of land, and it's addressed in the development agreement. Okay. Would someone, are there any questions from the public on Article T? If not, could someone make a motion?
Move to recommend favorable action on Article T.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Hi, Bill, welcome. Do you want to come up?
I think your agenda may have shifted.
We,
Quickly, I remembered it was much later, so I...
Yep. Come on up. We had a legislative update, and we're asked if that was taken off the agenda Friday. I appreciate you bringing that up, because our state legislatures felt that if they came in several weeks, they would have more information about the status of the budget, as well as a few other matters, so,
Thank you, sir.
welcome.
Bob, I have a diagram.
So this is Article V, which are the funds for town wharfs. And we have the chair of the Harbor Development Committee.
That's an incredible picture, Bill.
Good evening to the selectmen and to those who may be looking at us from home. Thank you. So you have not, prior to my hasty arrival here,
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
thank you for having me this evening. Catching my breath as I came up the stairs in a race. The parking lot is full. I don't know what else is happening here tonight. You're empty. I don't know.
We're always
what's
busy here in Hingham, Bill.
River Snow. So I bring only one physical thing, which is this incredible photo taken on January 30th this year. This is from the ramp leading to the bridge across to Whitney Wharf. And it shows rather dramatically what sea level rise and a storm and a high tide can do. And it's pretty darn dramatic. Is there any way that can be also put up
It's
here?
up, it's up
Oh,
on the
okay.
It's on
monitor,
for
Bill.
folks at
Great.
home.
So I came before your committee in December and also with the advisory committee in December to give a sense of where Harbor Development has been and the place that we landed in terms of a recommendation to our, well, really to you first, but ultimately to our consultants in terms of what the target height for the 4 town-owned wharves that we are considering here. And that was 10.7 feet, or give or take. And I told you at the time that in the interests of continuing to move this along, that yes, I would be back with the warrant article. And while away in January, I did craft a short article and attached to it, and I don't know whether you received it as well, a suggested comment just to give context here. If you did not, or perhaps for the benefit of the home audience, I could just, very briefly, it's very simple.
Thank you, sure.
So, the article reads, will the town raise and appropriate, borrow or transfer from available funds a sum of money for the purpose of initial repair and restoration of 4 town-owned wharves at Town Pier, the POW MIA Park, the former mobile station parcel, and Barnes Wharf, or act on anything related thereto, inserted at our suggestion. And the comment, and I'm not jumping ahead of the advisory committee, I was just trying to give them a little context, and anybody who saw this little context of what is it that we're doing now. You remember, we have money and we are continuing to proceed with borings, initial designs, and ultimately permitting. for all 4 of the town wharves. We did that by virtue of articles passed in both in 2015 and again last year. So we have funding already for that, and we're beginning to have received some initial concepts, which the Harbor Development Committee will be considering. But we're looking ahead to when we have those concepts and we have permits, how do we get started? And the notion behind this article is as follows. Article 31 of the 2015 annual town meeting appropriated $175,000 for phase 1 of the repair and restoration of the town wharves, focusing first on an engineering assessment of the condition of all the wharves. During 2016 and 17, the Harbor Development Committee continued to pursue phase 2, engineering, design, and permitting, using an additional $240,000 approved by the 2017 annual town meeting for all 4 town-owned wharves. That work will continue in 2018 with a target of completed designs and plans and substantial progress on permit requests prior to the next funding cycle application of the Seaport Bond Council on August 2018. Seaport Bond Council typically entertains municipal grant requests for funding up to $1 million annually, contingent on matching town funding equal to 20% of the requested amount. The Seaport Bond Council is one example of potential grant opportunities that may require matching funds. The purpose of this article is to appropriate $200,000, constituting the town's match, to begin what is expected to be continued town investment in the reconstruction of these town-owned wharves to address their poor structural condition, expected sea level rise, and overall coastal resiliency. I went on to speak a little bit to funding, but I think that's something we should really discuss. But having returned from some holiday away, the very next day, this storm hit. And there were photos. This is a remarkable photo, and I've shared other photos I did at the December meeting, but frankly, this is the highest I've ever seen it, and it's a pretty telling. I had another photo that was from the driveway heading down to Town Pier, and you look out, and all you see is water. So the thrust here is it seems to make sense that Harbor Development Committee has always been try to plan long-term but be opportunistic. And if there's a chance to go after some funding, we should do that. We could structure an article such that it was contingent on receiving the grant, that the dollars not be spent on our end, because frankly, even $1 million is not going to be large in terms of the total cost of all 4 of these wharves. But it could potentially be one of the wharves. I'm not sure. Until we have these concepts, decide on a design, and then have our engineers price that out, we're not going to know the numbers. But this is intended to get us started. So that's the thrust, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
And Bill, do we know with the Seaport Bond Council, it's up to $1 million a year? But are they in a position where, if we're awarded the grant in 1 year, we can reapply in subsequent years against the same project? Do we know that?
I believe there's precedent for that, Mary, but I'm not certain.
Yeah.
And the other thing I should be very clear on, this is like school grants or any other grant. There are many who are after this kind of money. Whether Hingham would be blessed, we know that the town, the Bond Council did give us $700,000 toward our project at the Bathhouse Snack Shack, and they have kind of told us, well, we don't want to see you back until we see that you've succeeded.
Yeah.
And I think that's entirely appropriate. The expectation and hope would be that by August of 2018, we would be well on our way to be able to demonstrate, yep, here it is, the project is proceeding. If you file in August of 18, that's for consideration. I think the funding cycle is 6 months after that. So, it's time. But if you're denied one time, there's certainly no difficulty in applying again. And to my knowledge, the other towns, they have funded multiple cuts at the same project. And this is all in the context, you'll remember one of our earlier legislative updates. Paul, I think you were here, Karen, I know you were not, but when Garrett and Bob were here, they said, they told us, and this is 3 years ago, look, assess the whole thing, plan the whole thing, permit the whole thing, and then go after the money, but be opportunistic, and it may be, piece by piece. That's what we're trying to do. It's not to say that this town may not themselves need to step up and make this a priority. And I was pleased to see, and I want to thank the Selectmen for including in your goals, acting on the recommendations of town meeting over the last several years of prioritizing moving forward on items at the harbor, with town wharves being, one of the primary items.
Karen and Paul, questions?
Bill, are you making any headway on what the design of the walls is likely to be?
I mentioned, Paul, literally on Saturday, I got 7 concepts forwarded from Roger, coming from Beals and Thomas. Roger and myself, the vice chair of our committee, are going to meet next week with Beals and Thomas. We will take that topic up at our next meeting, which I think is March 7th. This is pretty much on the timeline that we would have expected. And there are some very interesting notions that have begun to be floated. We need to test those, and things like, you don't necessarily have to, we've agreed that 10.7 feet should be our, across the entire harbor. Does that all have to be right at the wall front? Or could it be a 2-step process where for Barnes Wharf or even for Town Pier, the front of the wharf and the granite wall surrounding it comes up 2+ feet, and further back in the land you have another tasteful additional wall. So if you're willing to allow periodically some water to go on there's nothing inherently valuable on Town Pier. The Iron Horse is safe. He's up about 10 feet. Barnes Wharf might be a different question once they actually had. So these are things we need to think about, explore with our consultants, talk to Hingham Maritime about, to see what's going to work for them, because we have our commitment under the lease. So the answer, Paul, is interesting notions, work to be done.
That'd be nice if that could be televised.
That meeting?
Yes.
Let me have our sessions early on with next week to figure out whether we're ready for prime time. I want to have it be far enough along. I mean, as I said, literally last Saturday, the very first notions of what these concepts might look like. I absolutely agree. To me, we've talked from the outset that this is the marriage of safety, cost, and aesthetics. And as a Harbor Development Committee, we've worked very hard for all of our stuff at making sure that for the key meetings when we're really focusing in on this and come to terms, that we did that in a meeting that others could see, whether that evening or on a delayed basis.
Good, thank you.
So in terms of the boring design and permitting, in that phase 1 money, it sounds like, is the boring complete on all wharfs and you're now in design phase?
We are, I know the boring is complete on Barnes and Town Pier. I'm not sure whether in my absence in the late December, early January timeframe, they also did the borings on POWMIA and the mobile station.
Okay.
But the fact that I'm seeing preliminary, concepts for that suggests to me that they have.
Okay.
But more homework to be done, Karen.
Okay. And then the process for that would be, you would come up with the design, and then you come back here for approval on that? How does that piece of the process work?
I view this as we've said from the outset, a very kind of interactive thing. I mean, I think our committee needs to do its homework and its diligence and be ready to come forward with either a single proposal, or as we did, as I came to you with the heights, saying, well, look, we could do this, or we could do something, that seems more, and we came to a conclusion, and you supported that. I expect that this is not a decision that was made in a vacuum, and it needs to be inclusive of a lot of parties here in town. As you know already, there are a number of other constituencies here who need to be heard from, whether it's the Hingham Maritime, the Historical Commission, Historic Districts Commission, because several of these parcels are
Right,
in
that's
the
what I
historic
wondered.
district. So there's got to be lots of visibility.
Okay, and do you have a sense of an overall number? So you're sort of taking 20% of some,
No, let me be real clear. This is simply grabbing for what is
something?
possible.
Okay,
Very early on, 2-3 years ago, when we sort of asked our consultant, well, just linear feet for granite, reconstruction, order of magnitude. And it was a big number. It's $10 to $15 million, probably. But until we get to a concept, now that we know our conditions, we've done this analytical survey,
Yeah.
we know where the weaknesses are. If a wall needs to be rebuilt, because remember, we're doing two things. One, we're repairing the existing wall, and two, we're addressing sea level rise by thinking about raising, whether at the wall, at the pier head, or slightly back, in some combination, raising to this uniform height of 10.7 feet across these 4 wharves. So Karen, to be fair, we're not going to really have a good number until we get a concept that we can all agree on and ask for that to be priced out.
okay. And so, I sort of come back to the construct of the question or the article for town meeting, and I throw this out to you and to Craig or to the advisory committee more generally. And I'm not familiar with this, so I don't know, but the way the question is worded now, the expenditure of the funds would be under the direction of the Harbor Development Committee without any input, maybe back to us. And then the purpose is for initial repair and restoration. So I guess I'm a little unclear. I hear you that this could be staged out and there may be things that we need to do to repair and restore what we have, but would any of this money also be used for the increase in the height? And I guess my question would be, do we feel like that's included in this language of initial repair and restoration?
I tried to be deliberately generic, knowing that I characterize this almost as a down payment. And if we came back that one of the wharves we could proceed on, and make some real progress on that particular wharf, that might make sense.
So I guess my response to that is I'm not sure this language gets you there. And so if we're trying to be as broad as we possibly could be to allow, the greatest flexibility in, as you suggest, if we're opportunistic and we got money and we saw our way clear to be able to complete a project on a wharf, I guess I'd feel more comfortable if this language or the ultimate recommended motion would build in not only initial repair and restoration, but potential improvement, I guess might be the language. But
You're addressing the sea level rise
That's
portion
correct.
of it, because
That's
it is
correct.
both. It is clearly both.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I've been talking with liaisons, actually, Dan Coughlin, who is also
Sorry, I was putting you
secretary
on
to
the
the
spot,
advisory
Craig.
committee, and therefore couldn't be here this evening. But I spoke with him yesterday, I spoke with Lucy over the weekend, both as to what this is, and secondly, and most importantly, from a funding, where do we look to for funding sources? And that's something I think we'd like to get into for a few minutes here. But, the thrust is, look, this is an attempt to begin going for money, whether it's from other sources. It's too early to be thinking about, ourselves until we've got a better sense of what the final numbers are going to be.
So I think what I'm hearing Karen say is whether, does the scope of the article as it's written contemplate all these different possibilities? And I think we can't broaden the recommended motion from the article. So it may also be a place, and, maybe, Bill, you could follow up with Tom, if this is a place where we just need an opinion from council to make sure that all of these different possible potential uses of funds are covered in the language, that might, that might be
My
appropriate.
key adjective was initial. And I perhaps didn't focus as much on, to me, repair, restoration, and resiliency have been part of that from the beginning, but I
and
understand
you may be right. I just want to make sure that, personally, I'd like to see the recommended motion, the language in the recommended motion be as broad as it possibly could be to allow
Yes.
for the expenditure of the funds, as you suggest, once we have a design and we potentially have funding sources and we are ready to move money around for these wharfs, what's the best way to spend the money at this particular time? And I guess I throw this back to you and ultimately to the advisory committee to consider both the designation of purpose here as well as the direction of the party that's directing the expenditure of the funds.
And I am, totally ambivalent in terms of, whether ultimately it comes to the selectmen, because you would ultimately sign any contracts. That's not I have no concern there. And we are meeting, Craig, I think the advisory committee is taking this up Thursday?
To hear it on Thursday.
To hear it on Thursday and to vote sometime next week. So I will continue those conversations, and I hear you.
Okay.
Did you have any other questions about the scope? Because I did want to
Nope.
just spend a couple minutes. And Tom, maybe just on the source of funds, we get all these warrant articles, and I remember once on advisory, it was sort of a how are we going to pay for all these things? And so I think one of the things we try to do, without necessarily binding the advisory committee, is to offer a point of view. And I think you've got a little preliminary information, but it was my intention that we would probably hear this tonight, but not vote it until a later date, because we would just want to make sure there's alignment on the source of funding.
Okay.
So there's a couple of options for funding, right? We could use the general fund, or we could use mooring-related or harbor-related revenue. So the harbor-related revenue, you have waterways account, you have a dredging account, you have the mooring fees. In speaking recently with the harbor master and the town accountant, it appears that within a year to 2 years, we're going to have a dredging project happen in our harbor. It's a little bit early. We haven't done the sounding study yet, but the anticipation is that on the outside, 2 years, we're gonna be dredging. The anticipated cost, and this is a very early estimate, I don't have any concrete information backing this estimate, but it's early estimate from Ken Corson, is about $1.7 million for the dredging project. Right now, we have, and again, early estimates, no concrete data, but as we look at these different accounts, we have approximately $1 million available now. We anticipate, in talking to Sue Nickerson, being able to fund the 1.7 through those accounts or close to it in 2020. So that gives us another year to try to build those revenues as opposed to trying to do it this year. Now, the question is, we have the dredging need and we have the potential, the harbor resiliency project. So if we were to seek an alternate source of funds for the harbor resiliency project of the seawalls, then that would be a source that would be probably logically looked at. And the question becomes, can we afford it out of that money and still do our dredging project? Bill and I met very briefly, I talked on the phone very briefly about this last week. Earlier this week, I met with Sue Nickerson and Ken Corson about this, again, earlier this week or late last week. And it's all very preliminary. I hope to be able to put a little bit more meat on this bone prior to AdCom's review on Thursday. So this is what I have for you now. I would suggest that you, like you had suggested, Mary, that maybe you not consider voting tonight. Allow me to get some more information and hopefully answer a lot of what I anticipate are going to be your questions along the lines of funding sources prior to your vote.
Could I supplement a few
Sure,
things that
please.
Thomas, because we did speak 2 days ago, I think it was. Two things to really emphasize. First, the $1.7 million. I haven't been able to catch up to Ken this week,
Yeah, I was
and
wondering
so I
about
haven't had that conversation, but I know, he's probably gone to the outside. He really won't know until he does this sonar
Soundings,
sounding,
That's right.
because it's all volume. It's how many cubic yards of material need to be dredged, and he'll know that once that work is done. And we have money for that. There was a grant, actually, to accomplish that, and we can do that fairly quickly
Yep.
this spring.
Yep.
So that's one item. The second is, in terms of the sources, this is something I had looked at hard with Sue in December, Sue and Ken. And there are these multiple sources, and maybe one other that we've talked about. I think it may be a little higher than what Thomas suggested, but he's right. If we targeted 2020, it sounds like we'd be real close to the $1.7 million if it is that much.
Right.
And as you remember, this is the first time that it's really probably going to all be on the town.
Right.
In the past, we've had opportunities to get money from the state. The other opportunity that I know you and Ken and I have talked about is it may be possible if we team up with some other towns to get some volume discounts. If Weymouth and Hull and Quincy all needed dredging, if you got the dredging company to mobilize once for all 4 of those towns, maybe the $1.7 million number comes down. But, I think the issue remains, do we want to be careful, cautious, try to preserve the mooring permit fees? And we know that builds at a roughly $250,000, $260,000 a year. That's pretty well known. So these are just some of the parameters. Do you want to mention the other possibility in terms of?
You go ahead. Yeah.
Well, Tom and I, in talking, he posed to me the question. He said, Bill, I had drafted my comment initially to say probably the source is mooring permit fees, because it clearly is relevant. But he asked me the question, do you have any particular leaning where it comes from? And my answer to that was no. I simply wanted to make it as easy on the rest of the town's budgeting process as possible, knowing that there are always demands on the general fund and so forth. And I'm assuming this year is no exception. So his question to me was, well, look, ultimately, aren't we going to be doing a pretty big project here, and aren't we likely to have to go ahead and bond that? We're not, the likelihood of getting all of this from some very state godparent is not high. So his question to me was, if we're going to bond this anyway, one other issue might be to borrow the funds, and that could be, as we have in the past, borrowing from ourselves, packaging it with some other, small borrowings, knowing that when we get further down the road, we're going to be bonding probably a bigger project.
And sometimes, I think when we've done that in the past, if that is the long-term financing plan, sometimes the initial money up front, we've often just taken that out of fund balance, and then when we wrap it into the borrowing, we essentially then replenish fund
Reimburse.
balance. So there's some different things here. I think we're all mindful of, we want to be careful that we don't mentally commit the same dollars to different places. I'm also aware that we have capital outlay coming in, and sometimes the harbor master capital requests get funded from there. So I think we want to look at all of it in totality, mindful. We talked about the operating budget. If you look at the 5-year forecast, I think we'd like to avoid a circumstance where we have to budget dredging in the Article 6 budget.
Right.
If we can make some headway on this, and again, I think we offer a point of view, but ultimately it is the advisory committee's decision as to the source of funds. I think the information that we're going to be getting will benefit their recommendation as well. Yeah. Anything else for Bill?
No, just thanks for the
Thank
good
you.
work, Bill.
Save this for town meeting. It's quite a picture.
Oh, don't worry.
Quite a picture.
Yeah, I had a quite similar picture at last year's town meeting, but this is probably a foot higher than the one that I showed a year ago. And Lucy Hancock, I think, actually went down to Red Eye Roasters and, came away saying, when do we start? When do we start raising the walls?
Yeah.
Because it was pretty
Very
dramatic.
dramatic,
Yep.
yeah. Bill, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you for deferring your consideration of Article V until I could mount the stairs.
No worries, no worries.
I'll be in touch.
Tom, why don't we go to Article S next? I'm just, like, we're sort of down near the harbor,
Okay,
and Article S has to do with a little bit down by the harbor.
sure. So we are, as part of our lease agreement with Hingham Maritime, that we signed 2 Decembers ago, the town had committed to exploring sewer connection possibilities for that potential development there, or the potential upgrades to that operation. And to that end, we have put together a quote. Looks like it's in the amount of $53,300 to seek approval from the MWRA in the form of an engineering application to both connect the Barnes Wharf site as well as the Hingham Public Library, quite simply because it was the nearest town facility to the MWRA's jurisdiction or boundaries. And, you never know down the line what you might want to do in terms of septic versus sewer. And if there was a connection opportunity there, maybe that would be the least costly of all of the town buildings that aren't already on sewer to get them onto sewer. So we incorporated the Hingham Public Library site, or the building, or the location, I should say, the property, into this quote. And again, $55,300 for a consultant to submit an application to the MWRA to determine whether or not those sites would be allowed to be added into the MWRA's district.
Questions?
Yes. Do you have any sense as to whether if such a line is allowed, whether the MWRA allows other owners to tie in?
I don't have the answer to that question. I could get it for you, Paul.
I'm curious to know that.
I would imagine not, just because the application process is going to speak to the flow, the anticipated inflow into their network. And if you were adding additional properties, then that would obviously affect that number. So I would imagine not.
And if we apply, are we bound to move forward with
No.
both connections?
Thank you. I should have said that in my introduction. Absolutely not. These are funds that would be authorized by town meeting to be spent by the town to seek these approvals from the MWRA. Not require us to do it.
I'd just add 2 things. One is that when we, signed the lease with Hingham Maritime, we, as part of that lease, essentially said that the town, one of the town's responsibilities, and this is a Phase 1 milestone, is that we would try to secure the approvals, because this is necessary to get sewer service and restrooms down onto Barnes Wharf. We also thought that there would be some economies of scale with the library, and, in speaking with the trustees and the library director, while right now the library doesn't contemplate needing it, it just feels like a good idea for a little bit extra money to kind of get that. And so we had some correspondence from David Mahegan and some feedback from Linda Harper, both saying that if the library could be included in the scope of this, it would be helpful.
Do we have some sense of that incremental additional cost by including the library?
It was minimal. I want to say it was an additional maybe $10,000, $15,000. I had the original quote without that in there from last year, but I don't remember offhand what that figure was.
Okay.
And I think according to the warrant article language, this, I think for $50,000, this is the kind of thing that we usually take out of, that we usually fund out of fund
Fund
balance.
balance.
Yep, and there's, on the Article 6 forecast, there's we bring it in. You know, I really like the idea of moving ahead on this because it helps us advance what we want to do with Barnes Wharf. And obviously, the ability to move forward on that facility, et cetera. And I think this is also a visible sign, not just to our partners at Hingham Maritime, but also to the public who will be asking to contribute to their fundraising effort. This is an important milestone that I think might just help with some of the fundraising because it helps make it look, it's making it real.
Yep, I don't disagree. I guess I just heard conflicting interest on the part of the library for inclusion in the process. And, you know, while I understand incrementally it's $10,000 or $15,000, given your earlier slide presentation.
Yep.
I just, you know, if they're saying they want to be included, that's great, but my understanding was they have a working septic and at this point didn't really see a need to be tied in, so.
Yeah, that was the initial conversation, and then subsequent to that, both David Mahagan and Linda Harper reached out and said, you know, we've talked about this a little bit. They ran it by some of the other trustees, and I think the collective feeling was that it would be helpful.
Okay.
Any questions from the public? Would someone like to make a motion?
Move to recommend favorable action on Article 5.
Article S.
S,
Second.
absence 4.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. The next one is Article N, which is to accept Mass General Law, Chapter 64N, Section 3, the marijuana sales tax. Tom, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah, it didn't get, I don't have it unfortunately in my packet, you guys probably do. Thank you. So this is to allow the town, should it not be banned, this would allow the town to tax the sales of recreational marijuana, and at the rate of 3%.
Low-hanging fruit.
Well, and you know, I know we're going to take up on March 6th, we're going to take up the question of the general bylaw. I know the planning board is working on the time, manner, and place regulations. They will also have a zoning bylaw. The reason that we're hearing this now is, to me, in some ways, this is sort of a distinct issue, and, you know, it would seem to me that if town meeting wants to allow these establishments, if they were to operate, there would be town services required to ensure that they were abiding by regulations. And so it seems to me that we would want to adopt favorable action on Article N, understanding that if a ban is in place, that, you know, yeah, it's a moot point.
And it's 3% of total sale price received, okay? Which is the maximum allowed by statute.
That's the maximum allowed, yep.
Right.
And, you know, we tried to check to see, remember when we were looking to adopt the meals tax, there were estimates that were put out there, but those were actually based on collections at the state level. This is a whole new thing, so really, any sort of estimates about sales, about potential revenue, you know, it feels really speculative.
Yep. Yep.
More than zero.
And and if we don't vote to accept Chapter 64N and the ban fails, we end up with marijuana establishments in town where we get no local tax dollars as a result.
Correct. And then again, you know, there will, I think with these establishments, there will be extra effort required, extra demand on town services.
You think so, Chief?
The 3% goes into the general fund, Chief.
Well, I was going to ask about that.
I'm sure you were.
Any further comment, or someone like to make a motion?
I move to recommend favorable action on Article N, the acceptance of Mass General Law, Chapter 64N, Section 3, marijuana sales tax.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
I would also just point out to the public that the board voting favorable action on Article N is independent of the question we'll be taking up in a couple weeks, which is the question of a ban. So looking forward to that discussion. Our final warrant article for the evening is Article U. And Article U, this is going to be deja vu all over again. Last week, we had a public hearing on the naming of a conservation property located off South Pleasant Street. And so now that we have completed that, we are actually hearing Article U, which proposes to give the name Laner Conservation Area to the parcels of land that the town acquired last year with community preservation funds. Tom, we haven't received any correspondence. Okay. Any questions?
Nope, all my questions were answered last time.
Okay, you want to make a motion?
I move favorable action on Article U.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Okay, terrific. That concludes the warrant articles for this evening. Next Tuesday, we'll be taking up more warrant articles. The next item on the agenda is a Hingham Housing Authority 100 Beal Street discussion. Karen, I'm going to kind of turn this over to you.
Okay. You might recall a couple weeks ago, I updated you and Paul on my work with the Housing Authority with respect to 100 Beal Street. It's a parcel that in 2001, the Housing Authority agreed to transfer 8 acres, 8.1 acres, something like that, to the town as consideration under a contract for the demolition of ancillary buildings that were part of the Bear Cove Park site. You may recall that when we talked last time, that we thought we'd give the Housing Authority some additional time to kind of think through the action they took, which was to vote not to transfer that parcel back to the town, notwithstanding a clear obligation under the 2001 contract. So we're back tonight to talk about this some more. In the meantime, we received a letter from Mr. Keyes, Bob Keyes, who is now the new chair of the Housing Authority Board in the wake of the resignation of Daveline Cooper, who was the former chair of the Housing Authority Board. And Mr. Keyes is requesting some additional time to consider consider issues with respect to the parcel. I am a little frustrated by this, I have to say. I probably came out a little bit last week that I'm a little frustrated to be dealing with this. I started talking with the Housing Authority about the conveyance of the land last summer. I spent some time with Daveline Cooper, with Mr. Mayo and Mr. Alexiadis, reviewing all of the files that we had with respect to the obligation of the Housing Authority under the contract to transfer the property to the town. Answered her questions, provided her with documentation. She went back and talked with her board. And I took a look at the Housing Authority minutes, and there were definitely a couple of, they meet once a month, and there were definitely a couple of minutes that reflect discussions by the board and information provided to the board by Daveline of this very clear contractual obligation. Notwithstanding, I think that length of time and the provision of significant amount of information, to me, the Housing Authority is still not keeping the promise that it made to the town. I think last time around, I mentioned that the Housing Authority did what I would have done, which was request the diligence package that we put together, demonstrating that the town had provided had provided its consideration under the contract, namely the demolition of the buildings. And it was kind of a, dot your I, cross your T type of request. And we pulled together a pretty thick packet of stuff that includes old invoices, old contracts, the contract itself, correspondence, maps, again, demonstrating that the town kept its promise. And I said this last time around too, it's frustrating, and it's also really uncomfortable to be in this situation where an entity that resides in your town where folks that you know, are residents that you shop with and go to church with, live at the Housing Authority property on Thaxter Street, that their governing body is refusing to keep a promise that they made to the town. When you analyze this, that parcel is complicated. Those parcels over there are complicated. There are restrictions that have been placed on those parcels by the Department of the Interior. There were restrictions placed on the parcel by former boards of selectmen. There are wetlands issues, conservation issues, but that has nothing to do with the very narrow question that's before the Housing Authority Board, and that is, did you promise in 2001 that you would transfer this land to the town? Daveline Cooper is a lawyer, actually, in affordable housing. She's reviewed that contract, and she concluded, indeed, the Housing Authority has a legal obligation to make the transfer. They worked with a pro bono attorney prior to our last meeting, who, my understanding is, also concluded that they had a legal responsibility to transfer the land to the town. We have spent legal resources with Susan Murphy, not only in analyzing and pulling together all of the diligence materials that we've provided to the Housing Authority, but Susan came with me in November to a Housing Authority meeting where we explained all of these same issues, we laid out all of this same paperwork, and we opened ourselves up to whatever questions the Housing Authority had with respect to the contract. And aside from wanting the diligence package, there were no questions about the contract itself. So I apologize for being long-winded, but taxpayer dollars, Hingham taxpayer dollars were spent to demolish the buildings on Housing Authority property. And even though the Housing Authority, like I said before, is sort of like our cousin, it is actually a separate entity. It's a separate parcel. It's not the town. And so the town actually can't take taxpayer money and spend it for some other third party. And it can't spend that money for the Housing Authority without getting that consideration back. And so we have an obligation, which I think we talked about before, we have an obligation, uncomfortable or not, to enforce this contract. Mr. Keys has asked for some additional time, I think, to consider these issues and to, again, consult with counsel. And, given the nature of the request, and if you concur, I would say that, he's asking for 30 days. That would put us on or about our meeting on March 13th. And I guess from my perspective, the Housing Authority ought to be able, before March 13th, come to an understanding of their obligations under the contract and vote to convey the parcel back to the town. So I guess if you are amenable, I would suggest that perhaps we take up any further response to the Housing Authority on March 13th.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't like having these kind of conversations. They're awkward. I served with Irma Lotta. I know Bob Keys. I know Jim Watson. I know that Jim and Bob signed this agreement years ago to convey the land over. We paid $250,000 taxpayer dough. It's time to pony up. If you need 30 days to come to the conclusion that you agreed to do 10 plus years ago, so be it, but deal's a deal. I'm holding you to it. And I'm dead serious about that.
I would go along with my colleagues. I think the three of us have a responsibility as stewards of the town. We talked about our stewardship responsibility earlier in the meeting when we were looking at the financials, and This to me is part of that role and part of the obligation that we have as the people that are occupying these seats right now. If I look at the memorandum of agreement, it's very clear, in consideration of the demolition and removal of the buildings, the authority agrees that it will transfer to the town of Hingham the parcel of land off Beal Street shown as Lot 2 on the plan attached here 2 as Exhibit A. Tom, why don't we put this on our agenda for March 13th? I hope that at that time, we will have a representative here from the Housing Authority, and that we can bring this matter to conclusion so that all of us can continue on with the important work that we do for the town.
Great.
Okay. Any appointments tonight?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Selectmen and Town Administrator reports. Tom, do you have anything?
I just wanted to notify and let everyone know that, I'm going to read a brief statement, but this is a wonderful program. Pink Patch Project is an initiative of the National Police Movement to support breast cancer research. The Hingham Police Department was one of the first departments in Massachusetts to participate in this program. On Friday, February 9th, Chief Olson and representatives of the Hingham Police Department went to Boston to deliver a check in the amount of $2,300 to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. These are funds raised by our HPD in support of this mission every year. And I just want to say congratulations and great job to you and to your force and to the guys and the gals.
Very nice visitor.
Great job. Okay.
And I have a great picture of the chief with Wally the Green Monster.
Maybe before we go to Town Administrator reports, and thank you, when there are these votes down at the bottom, I tend to sometimes overlook them, but we have a request to,
Liquor license, so.
it's to approve a request of Legal Seafoods, so can you just?
Sure, there's two gentlemen that are being added to the Legal Seafoods Board of Directors, and as a result, all of their liquor licenses across the state have to reflect those names. That's all this is.
And it looked like it was consistent with state law and.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions, Paul?
No.
Make a motion?
Sure, I'll entertain a motion to approve the application of Legal Seafoods LLC, DBA Legal C, 96 Derby Street, for a change of managers to the Board of Managers as outlined in the letter from Massachusetts Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission dated January 17, 2018.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Karen or Paul, any updates, Selectmen updates?
Ladies and gentlemen, Summer Street Corridor pilot program continues to evolve. I want to thank the police and fire for their robust participation, as well as the DPW. We anticipate liaising with the towns of Hull and Cohasset shortly, set out in greater detail what we're proposing to do. The state is an enthusiastic participant, and we anticipate getting quite a bit of data to support the eventual redesign. I also want to thank Mr. Conroy. I thought he gave a great speech on Lincoln Day, and in fact he quoted one of my favorite lines in Abraham Lincoln, where when he visited Richmond shortly after the fall of the Confederacy, was asked by his generals whether he wanted to impose a harsh peace, and his words were, "Let him up easy." So I think we're doing that with the Housing Authority tonight. So, let's hope we're right.
Karen?
No, just Lincoln Day, to use a Paul Healy-ism, was a great take. It's always, to me, a thrill to be in that building, and it just really is a special day in Hingham, so I was proud to participate as a member of the Board of Selectmen.
Great. Yeah, it was a wonderful day, and also appreciated being back at the Heritage Museum. for a little gathering after. You know, just before we move into executive session, I just want to acknowledge that over on the room next to us is where Karen's and my former colleagues, the members of the advisory committee, are meeting. And this is really their very, very busy time of year. They're trying to settle budgets, hear warrant articles. They're meeting twice a week, and members are going to other meetings on alternate nights. This is just really crunch time for them, and the quality of the warrant that you receive and the quality of the financial and warrant article recommendations just reflects a lot of very hard work from 15 of our fellow citizen volunteers. And just want to acknowledge and thank them for the great work that they do. I know we all have been interacting with different members of the advisory committee as we've been, going through warrants and budget, and we appreciate all their time. So
Well,
with,
and
Please.
one further thing would be, it really represents the culmination of a lot of committee work over that time. So, the committees that, like Bill Reardon here tonight, all of those folks have to do their work in advance of this process, and then, then it hits this more centralized review. And so it's just really a heavy lift by a number of volunteers, and the town wouldn't be run the way it is run without all of that work.
and their hearings are open to the public, and they welcome hearing from the public. With that, our next meeting will be next Tuesday, February 20th. We understand that that is school vacation week, but also in trying to make sure that we conclude our business so that our advisory colleagues can work. We do have a full agenda for next week. We've tried to schedule warrant articles that we think are of great public interest. We're not doing those next week. We're trying to also take care of some other business before this board, so that on the 27th, we will take up budgets and some other articles. We will be hearing the capital outlay recommendations next week. We will not be voting on those. We will hear those next week. So with that, the board is going to convene an executive session under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A2, to conduct a strategy session in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, Interim Town Administrator Thomas Mayo, regarding potential contract and appointment as Town Administrator. The board will not resume in open session. Roll call vote.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Night.
Thank you.